They trained for men. What came at them were mountains that breathed. 40,000 Roman infantry stood in formation, shields locked, certain of victory. Then the earth began to shake. 3,000 shapes emerged, taller than houses, armored in bronze, screaming through their trunks. The Romans had fought cavalry, phalanx, siege engines. They had never fought the ground itself. They came not to trample, but to unlearn the rules of war. Each step crushed bone, snapped spear, erased discipline. Some men covered their ears, some prayed, most simply ran. That day, Carthage didn't charge with courage, it charged with extinction. This is the story of the battle where the ground itself chose a side, and Rome learned that fear has weight. Before Rome ruled the world, Carthage ruled the seas. A city of traders and mercenaries, built on salt, silver, and silence. Its empire stretched from Spain to the sands of Libya, its fleets darker than the horizon. Carthage didn't fight for glory, it fought for profit. Every contract was a campaign, every victory an investment. While Rome raised citizen armies, Carthage bought soldiers from every shore. Libyans, Iberians, Numidians, men who fought for pay, not pride. At the center stood the Barcid family, Hamilcar, the general who swore his son to vengeance against Rome. That son, Hannibal, would one day cross the Alps. But before him came another war and another battlefield, the plains of Bagradas. Here, Carthage would unleash a weapon Rome had never mastered. Not machines, not gods, beasts, 3,000 war elephants drawn from the jungles of Africa and India. Each one a fortress of flesh and iron, trained to kill without hesitation. Their tusks were tipped with bronze, their foreheads painted with symbols of the storm god Baal. Behind each beast rode a driver, the mahout, holding a hammer and a spike. If an elephant broke formation, the hammer fell. Control through fear, discipline through death. The Romans had heard rumors of these creatures but never seen them at scale. They laughed at the idea that animals could break legions. They would not laugh for long. As Carthage prepared its army, scouts returned with reports of Roman numbers. 40,000 infantry, organized, disciplined, predictable. Hamilcar understood what Rome never did. Order can be shattered faster than it can be rebuilt. He didn't plan to outthink the Romans. He planned to drown them, not with blood, with movement. When the horns sounded, the sky itself would shake. And in that moment, Carthage would show the world that fear was a weapon, and that no man could stand against the weight of a living wall. The Romans marched across the plains of the Bagradas River certain of victory. 40,000 infantry, 10,000 auxiliaries, banners high, steel catching the sun. They had faced Macedonians, Gauls, and Greek phalanxes, all men, all predictable. But on this field, their discipline met something it could not measure. At dawn, the horizon began to move. At first, they thought it was dust. Then the dust started to roar. A vibration rolled through the soil, faint at first, then deep enough to rattle armor. Men felt it in their bones before they saw anything at all. The scouts galloped back, shouting reports that made no sense. Creatures as tall as towers, iron on their faces, men riding on their backs. The Roman commanders laughed. They had no word for what was coming. As the haze lifted, the truth appeared. Row upon row of beasts unlike anything the disciplined minds of Rome had imagined. Each elephant carried a tower with archers, each tusk plated with bronze. Their handlers whispered to them, striking drums to keep their rhythm steady. The earth shook under 3,000 synchronized steps. The noise was not battle. It was geology. The Romans tried to steady their line. Officers shouted orders drowned beneath the low thunder of the herd. Some men raised shields against dust and heat. Others froze, eyes wide at the sight of walls that breathed. Across the field, the Carthaginian horns called once, a long, guttural note, not to signal attack, but to provoke panic. The elephants responded with a collective scream that tore the air apart. It was the sound of nature weaponized. Hamilcar watched from his command ridge, silent. He knew that before the first spear was thrown, the battle was already half won. Fear moved faster than infantry. It shattered ranks long before contact. In that moment, Rome understood that no formation, no discipline, no doctrine could withstand something that made the ground itself revolt. The legions had been trained to fight men, but men could not outmarch earthquakes. The Carthaginian horns blew once, long, deep, deliberate. The sound wasn't a command. It was permission. 3,000 elephants began to move. Slow at first, like mountains shifting, then faster, like storms rolling downhill. Their tusks glowed dull bronze under the morning light. Their feet struck the earth in rhythm, turning dust into thunder. The Roman line trembled before the first impact. Shields rattled, horses reared. Veterans who had faced the Gauls, Macedonians, even Hannibal's father himself, froze in disbelief. The horizon was alive. The ground itself was charging. The elephants hit with the weight of a continent. Phalanxes folded like fabric. Men disappeared without sound beneath hooves the size of helmets. The smell of blood mixed with sand and sweat until the air itself became a weapon. Aris of Utica, one of the lead handlers, struck his elephant's flank to steer it left. The beast didn't listen. The noise had deafened it. Its eyes rolled white, trunk raised, tusks swinging like siege engines. It was no longer an animal. It was momentum. Archers in the towers rained javelins on the Roman rear while the beasts tore the front apart. Roman officers tried to rally their legions with signals, but no one could hear over the roar. Commands vanished. Order dissolved. Only movement remained. Some Roman lines held for seconds. Those in the center drove their pila into the beasts' chests. It slowed them. It didn't stop them. Armor cracked. Men vanished. The formations broke, not from death, but from disbelief. Within minutes, the front line was gone. Dust hid everything but the sound, the steady percussion of thousands of feet crushing history. The elephants did not kill with intelligence. They killed with physics. When the dust began to settle, half the Roman front had ceased to exist. Carthage's beasts stood heaving and blood-soaked, steam rising from their skin, their shadows stretching across a field where courage no longer mattered. What began as shock became slaughter. The Roman front no longer existed. It had dissolved into noise and dust. Commands vanished under the roar of the herd. Officers raised standards high above the chaos, hoping men would see them. Most never did. Cavalry horses panicked first. They turned, bolting through their own infantry, crushing men already trapped between beasts and formation. The ground shook with every collapse. No one could tell where the front line ended or where safety began. The elephants tore through shields and armor, their tusks sweeping in arcs wider than a man's reach. Each swing left a gap that swallowed whole units. Some of the beasts fell, pierced by pila and spears, but even dying they crushed the soldiers beneath them. The Romans fought blind, half choking on sand, half deaf from the screaming. What they faced was not battle. It was the physics of fear. Aris of Utica clung to his elephant's harness, shouting orders to no one who could hear. The air was thick with arrows and dust. He saw another handler trampled under his own beast, the hammer still in his hand. The herd had stopped obeying. Carthage had unleashed something it could no longer control. The Roman left broke first. Men ran toward the river, throwing down weapons, the discipline of generations gone in a heartbeat. Centurions tried to rally them, shouting oaths of Rome's honor, but honor is a word the dying can't hear. By noon, the plain was unrecognizable. Mud mixed with iron and blood, men and animals fused into one slow-moving mass. The elephants, wounded and enraged, turned on anything that moved. They killed Carthaginians as easily as Romans. The air reeked of rot and burned oil. From his ridge, Hamilcar saw victory turning to chaos. He ordered the drums silenced. The sound faded. The elephants slowed, confused, their energy spent, their rage burning out like a dying storm. When the dust settled, the field was silent again. Tens of thousands lay still, half of them crushed, the rest frozen in disbelief. Carthage had won, but what stood before them wasn't triumph. It was aftermath. By midday, the battlefield was unrecognizable. The Romans no longer fought. They survived. Carthage had won, but no one could tell which side still breathed. The elephants stood motionless among heaps of armor and bone. Steam rose from their skin like smoke from dying fires. Their tusks dripped red and bronze. Some beasts wandered aimlessly, trampling corpses from both armies. Others dropped to their knees, exhausted, trembling, their own strength killing them. The plain had become a grave that still moved. Carthaginian handlers tried to bring order with drums and torches, but the animals no longer heard commands. The air stank of burnt oil, blood, and fear. Aris of Utica dismounted his elephant at last. The beast's sides heaved, streaked with arrows. He touched its hide, warm, shaking, alive, and knew the victory had gone too far. Around him, Carthaginian soldiers stared in silence. They had never seen triumph look so much like loss. Hamilcar's banner still flew above the ridge, but even he understood the scale of what had happened. The army that had crushed 40,000 Romans could barely stand. Half his beasts were dead or maddened, and the rest would never fight again. Carthage had proven its strength, but strength without control is suicide in slow motion. When the wind shifted, the dust revealed what the roar had hidden. A field of armor glinting beneath bodies, swords still clenched in frozen hands. The sun burned white overhead, but no shadow moved. As the survivors gathered, the silence became unbearable. Some Carthaginians wept, others laughed, the sound brittle, disbelieving. They had created the most terrifying weapon in ancient warfare and learned too late that terror does not obey. The war elephants had done their work. So had gravity. So had fear. When night fell, fires burned across the plain, not for victory, for direction. So the living could see which way to walk out of the dead. In the years that followed, the story of that day spread faster than any army. Roman survivors spoke of beasts taller than towers, crushing men into the soil, shaking the air itself apart. They claimed 3,000 elephants had come from the sea like living storms. The truth was smaller, but the fear was greater. Carthage fed that fear. The generals wanted legend, not numbers. They told tales of creatures blessed by Baal, armored in sunlight, unstoppable under the god's command. Traders carried those stories to every coast, and soon even distant kingdoms prepared their armies for enemies that never existed. Rome learned faster. Its commanders studied the chaos, found patterns inside the madness. They realized elephants were not divine. They were predictable. Noise, fire, gaps in formation. The countermeasures were written before the next war began. At Zama, decades later, Scipio Africanus would use those lessons. He would open lanes through his legions and let the beasts charge through empty air. The same sound that once shattered Rome would echo harmlessly into the distance. Carthage had built its strength on spectacle, and Rome turned that spectacle into science. The myth that had conquered fear now became its own ruin. The elephant ceased to be a god of war and returned to being an animal. What survived wasn't power, it was memory. For generations afterward, Roman children were told of the battle where the earth moved. Parents whispered that the ground still trembled where the elephants fell, not as a warning against Carthage, but against believing that fear itself could be controlled. Carthage never built another army of that size. The empire that once ruled the waves began to drown beneath its own legend, and in the silence that followed, Rome rewrote the story, not of how they were defeated, but of how they learned never to be afraid again. Centuries later, the desert still remembers. Every spring wind that crosses the plains of Tunisia carries the faint echo of thunder, not from storms, but from footsteps. Archaeologists find traces where the battle once stood: bronze tusk caps, iron spearheads twisted by pressure, fragments of towers once tied to living flesh. The soil itself holds the imprint of movement so heavy it changed its shape. Even time couldn't erase the weight of that day. The Romans recorded it as defeat. The Carthaginians called it victory. But neither side truly won. The elephants did what they were made to do, and then what they chose. Aris of Utica never returned to war. He stayed near the coast, tending the last surviving beast, a single elephant too old to fight, its eyes milk white from age. He said its breath still carried the smell of the battlefield, and that sometimes, at night, it raised its trunk toward the horizon as if hearing something far away. When the elephant finally died, Aris buried its tusks in the sand facing Rome. He marked the spot with a single stone carved with 7 words. The earth remembers what fear forgets. The Romans would march again. Carthage would burn. Empires would fall and rise until only their ruins remained. But the sound never faded. It lived beneath the soil, in the stories of soldiers, in the silence that follows every victory too costly to name. And long after the armies were gone, the ground still trembled for them. History doesn't repeat, it remembers. Subscribe to Brutal Past for the battles time tried to bury, and the truths that refuse to die.